life for over $15 million. The smell of stale coffee and the fluorescent hum of the office break room will forever remind me of the moment I overheard my brother Marcus whispering into his phone, "Don't worry, she'll never figure it out. Sarah's too stupid to see what's right in front of her face." If you're wondering how a family could orchestrate such an elaborate betrayal against their own blood, stick around because this story will change everything you think you know about trust and revenge. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe because you're about to witness the most satisfying comeuppance you've ever seen. Growing up in the cramped two-bedroom apartment above Chen's Golden Dragon restaurant in Chicago's Chinatown, I learned the meaning of hard work before I could properly hold chopsticks. The walls were so thin, I could hear Mrs. Wong next door arguing with her husband about money every single night, and the smell of grease seemed permanently embedded in every piece of clothing I owned. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but a suitcase full of dreams and a recipe for the best General Tso's chicken on the South Side. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd wake to the sound of my mother's knife hitting the cutting board in rhythmic precision, preparing vegetables for the day ahead. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I'd tiptoe downstairs to help before school, my small hands learning to fold wontons with the same careful attention my grandmother had taught my mother decades earlier. My father would already be at the stove, his face glistening with sweat, perfecting sauces that would make customers drive 40 minutes just for a taste. But despite their incredible work ethic and the restaurant's growing reputation, we were always struggling. I remember the embarrassment of wearing the same 3 outfits to school in rotation, the way my stomach would growl during lunch because I'd given my meal money to help pay for new fryer oil, and the constant fear that we'd lose everything if someone got sick or the health inspector had a bad day. My parents would whisper in Mandarin late at night, thinking I couldn't understand their worried conversations about rent, supplies, and the American dream that seemed just out of reach. My older brother Marcus and younger sister Jenny seemed to handle the pressure differently than I did. Marcus, 3 years older and effortlessly charismatic, would charm his way out of restaurant duties, claiming he needed to focus on his grades to get into Northwestern. Jenny, the baby at 16, had inherited my mother's delicate features and my father's sharp business sense, but she spent most of her time complaining about how embarrassing it was to smell like fried rice at school.
Me?
I threw myself into everything. I'd work the register after school, memorizing every customer's usual order and greeting them with genuine warmth. I'd stay up until midnight doing homework after scrubbing down the kitchen, and I'd wake up early on weekends to help prep for the lunch rush. When I wasn't at the restaurant, I was tutoring other kids in math to earn extra money for the family, my textbooks spread across sticky tabletops between orders. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school when my father had his first heart attack. I'll never forget the sound of the ambulance siren cutting through the dinner rush, or the way my mother's hands shook as she tried to call 911 while simultaneously flipping spring rolls to prevent them from burning. The hospital bills started piling up immediately, and with Dad unable to work, the restaurant's income dropped by 60% almost overnight. That's when I made the decision that would define the next decade of my life. Northwestern had accepted me with a partial scholarship, but even with financial aid, we couldn't afford the remaining tuition. Marcus was already there studying business, and my parents had sacrificed everything to make that happen. So I deferred my acceptance, took out a small business loan for $8,000, and threw myself into saving the family restaurant. Working 18-hour days became my new normal. I'd open the restaurant at 10 a.m., handle the lunch rush, manage inventory and payroll in the afternoon, work the dinner service, and then stay until 2 a.m. cleaning and prepping for the next day. My hands were constantly stained with soy sauce. My back ached from leaning over the wok, and I hadn't had a day off in 6 months. But slowly, gradually, we started turning things around. I implemented a delivery system before most restaurants in our area had even considered it, spending my own money on insulated bags and hiring 2 reliable drivers. I created a customer loyalty program using index cards and rubber stamps because we couldn't afford a computer system, but it worked. I negotiated better prices with our suppliers, redesigned the menu to highlight our most profitable dishes, and started catering small office parties and family celebrations. Within 2 years, Chen's Golden Dragon had gone from barely surviving to thriving. We were clearing $25,000 profit each month, had a waiting list on Friday nights, and food bloggers were writing reviews calling us a hidden gem and authentic family treasure. I had single-handedly saved our family's livelihood, and at 21, I was managing a business that employed 8 people and served over 300 customers daily. But instead of gratitude, I faced constant criticism from my own siblings. Marcus would visit from college with his fraternity brothers, loudly complaining about how embarrassing it was that his sister was just a restaurant worker while he was studying finance at a prestigious university. Jenny would bring her friends by and make snide comments about how I smelled like the kitchen and how she couldn't wait to get out of this dump. The worst part was Sunday family dinners, when my parents would praise Marcus for his grades and Jenny for her college applications, while barely acknowledging that I had literally saved our family from bankruptcy. When I tried to share ideas about expanding the business or mention how exhausted I was, Marcus would roll his eyes and say things like, "Sarah, you're thinking too small. This restaurant stuff is fine for now, but you need to think bigger if you want to make real money." I kept telling myself they'd eventually see my worth, that once Marcus graduated and saw how successful I'd made the restaurant, he'd respect what I had accomplished. I convinced myself that Jenny's attitude was just typical teenage behavior and that my parents' focus on my siblings' education was just their way of ensuring everyone had opportunities. After 3 years of this dynamic, something shifted. Marcus graduated from Northwestern with a business degree and immediately started talking about taking the restaurant to the next level. He'd sit at our corner table with his laptop, making phone calls to potential investors and drawing up expansion plans that involved opening 5 new locations within 2 years. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Finally, my brother was going to help carry the load. Finally, someone else in the family would understand the pressure I'd been under. Finally, we could work together to build something even bigger and better. Marcus presented his expansion plan to the family on a rainy Tuesday in October, complete with PowerPoint slides and projected revenue charts. The numbers were impressive. He calculated we could be making over $2 million annually within 5 years if we executed his strategy correctly. My parents were mesmerized by his presentation, nodding along as he explained franchise opportunities and market penetration strategies. But then came the part that made my stomach drop. "Of course," Marcus said, clicking to his final slide, "we'll need someone reliable to manage the original location while I focus on expansion and business development. Sarah's been doing a decent job keeping things running, so she can continue in that role." A decent job. 3 years of 18-hour days, of sacrificing my education and social life, of turning a failing business into a gold mine, and he called it a decent job. But I swallowed my pride and focused on the bigger picture. We were going to be a real family business, working together, building something amazing. Over the next 18 months, I threw myself into supporting Marcus's vision with the same intensity I'd brought to saving the original restaurant. When he needed $75,000 to secure a lease on the second location, I co-signed the loan. When he needed someone to train the new kitchen staff, I worked 16-hour days splitting time between both restaurants. When he needed capital for equipment and renovations, I agreed to take a salary cut and reinvest my earnings into the expansion. The second location opened to great fanfare, with Marcus giving interviews to local food magazines and positioning himself as a young entrepreneur revolutionizing Asian cuisine in Chicago. The third location followed 8 months later, then the fourth. Each opening required more of my time, more of my money, and more of my unwavering support. By this point, Jenny had graduated high school and started college at DePaul, studying marketing with dreams of working in fashion. But during her summer breaks, she'd help out with the restaurant's social media and customer service, showing a natural talent for connecting with people and creating engaging content that drove more business. What I didn't realize was that while I was working myself to exhaustion supporting the family expansion, Marcus and Jenny had been having private conversations about the future of the business. Conversations that didn't include me. The first sign something was wrong came during a family meeting in March, when Marcus announced he wanted to formalize our business structure and get everything properly documented for tax purposes. He'd hired a lawyer, he explained, and we needed to sign some paperwork to protect everyone's interests as we continued growing. I should have read every single page of those documents more carefully. I should have hired my own lawyer instead of trusting that my family had my best interests at heart. But I was so exhausted from managing 4 restaurant locations while Marcus handled strategy and Jenny managed marketing that I just signed where they told me to sign. The paperwork was dense and full of legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but Marcus assured me it was just standard business protection stuff. "Don't worry about all the technical language," he said with that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "The important thing is we're all protected, and everything's official now." What I had actually signed was a series of documents that gradually transferred ownership of all 4 restaurant locations to Marcus, with Jenny listed as a minority partner. My name appeared nowhere as an owner, despite the fact that I had invested over $200,000 of my own money and co-signed loans worth nearly $500,000. But I didn't discover this until almost a year later, and by then, it was too late to undo the damage easily. The revelation came in the most mundane way possible. I was at the bank trying to get a small business credit line approved to cover some equipment repairs when the loan officer, Mrs. Patricia Williams, looked confused as she reviewed my application. "I'm sorry, Miss Chun," she said, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she flipped through my paperwork. "But according to our records, you're not listed as an owner of Chen's Golden Dragon Enterprises. The account shows Marcus Chun as primary owner and Jennifer Chun as secondary. Are you perhaps applying as an employee or manager?" The words hit me like a physical blow. My hands started shaking so badly, I had to set down my coffee cup to avoid spilling it all over her desk. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and far away. "I'm Sarah Chun. I've been running these restaurants for 5 years. I co-signed all the major loans." Mrs. Williams pulled up additional screens on her computer, her expression growing more concerned as she reviewed the information. "You're definitely listed as a loan guarantor on several accounts, which means you're responsible for the debt if the business defaults. But in terms of ownership structure, you're not showing up as having any equity stake in the company." The fluorescent lights in the bank suddenly seemed too bright, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I mumbled some excuse about needing to review my own paperwork and stumbled out of the building onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, where the smell of hot dogs and car exhaust made me feel nauseous. That night, I spread every document I had ever signed across my kitchen table, reading each page with the intensity of someone studying for the most important exam of their life. And there it was, hidden in subsection C of page 14 of the partnership agreement. Sarah Chun agrees to transfer all ownership interest in Chen's Golden Dragon restaurant and any subsidiary locations to Marcus Chun in exchange for continued employment and profit-sharing arrangement. Profit-sharing arrangement. I was an employee in the business I had built with my own hands. The next morning, I confronted Marcus in his office above the original restaurant location, the same space where my father used to do paperwork late at night, surrounded by stacks of invoices and supply catalogs. Marcus was leaning back in an expensive leather chair I didn't remember him buying, talking on the phone about opening a 5th location in Evanston. "We need to talk," I said after he hung up, my voice steadier than I felt. "Sure, what's up?" he replied with that same casual tone he'd used when we were kids and he'd been caught stealing candy from the corner store. "I want to see all the ownership documents for the restaurants. The real ones, not the summaries you showed me last year." Something flickered across Marcus's face, a micro-expression of panic that he quickly covered with confusion. "Sarah, what's this about? You seem upset." "I found out I'm not listed as an owner anywhere, Marcus. Despite investing my life savings, despite co-signing hundreds of thousands in loans, despite working 18-hour days for 5 years to build this business, I'm legally just an employee." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the lunch prep happening in the kitchen below us, the chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of oil in the wok, the rapid-fire Mandarin between the cooks. Sounds that used to comfort me, but now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "Look, Sarah," he finally said, leaning forward with his hands clasped. I know this is confusing, but everything we did was to protect the business. If something happened to you, if you got sued or had financial problems, we needed to make sure the restaurants wouldn't be affected. This way, you get all the benefits of ownership without any of the legal risks. What benefits, Marcus? I'm working more hours than ever, making less money than I was 3 years ago, and I have no control over decisions that affect my future. Meanwhile, you're taking home 6 times what I make while I'm the one actually running the operations. You're being dramatic, Sarah. You knew this was always going to be a family business with me in charge. I'm the one with the business degree, the one with the vision to expand, the one handling all the complicated financial stuff you don't understand. The condescension in his voice was so familiar, so deeply rooted in our family dynamic, that it took me a moment to recognize how insulting it was. The complicated financial stuff I don't understand? Marcus, I turned this restaurant from bankruptcy to profitability before you even graduated college. I designed the systems, built the customer base, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier contracts. What exactly do you think I don't understand? Look, if you're not happy with the arrangement, we can discuss adjusting your compensation or giving you more vacation time. But the ownership structure isn't changing. That's final. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was deliberate, calculated. My own brother had systematically stolen the business I had built, and he had no intention of making it right. The confrontation with Jenny happened 3 days later, and it was somehow even worse than facing Marcus. I found her at the DePaul campus coffee shop where she liked to study, her marketing textbooks spread across a table covered with empty latte cups and highlighter caps. I know about the ownership documents, I said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from her. Jenny looked up from her laptop, and I saw something in her expression that I had never noticed before, a coldness that reminded me uncomfortably of our grandmother, who had never approved of my father's decision to marry my mother. What about them? She asked, not even pretending to be surprised. You knew, didn't you? You knew Marcus was cutting me out of the business while I was working myself to death to make it successful. Jenny closed her laptop slowly and leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sarah, can I ask you something honestly? Did you really think this was going to go any other way? The question hit me like a slap. What do you mean? I mean, did you honestly believe that someone like you is going to end up owning a multi-million-dollar business? You're not a leader, Sarah. You're a worker. You're good at following directions and putting in long hours, but you don't have the vision or the education to run something big. The coffee shop suddenly felt too loud, too bright, too full of college students who seemed impossibly young and carefree. Someone like me? I repeated. You dropped out of college to flip egg rolls, Sarah. Marcus has a degree from Northwestern. I'm studying business marketing. We understand things about running a modern company that you just don't get. The social media strategy, the branding, the expansion planning, the financial structuring, that's not stuff you learn by working in a kitchen. I saved this family from losing everything, Jenny. And we're grateful for that. We really are. But saving something and building something are completely different skills. Marcus has grown the business from 1 location to 4 in 2 years. The revenue has increased by 400% since he took over strategic planning. You are great at keeping the original restaurant afloat, but you would never have been able to scale it like he has. I stared at my little sister, this person I had helped raise, whose college tuition I had helped pay, who I had taught to drive and given dating advice and supported through every teenage crisis. And I realized I was looking at a stranger. So, what happens now? I asked. Now you can choose to keep being part of the family business in the role that makes sense for your skill set, or you can choose not to. But either way, the ownership structure isn't changing. Walking across that college campus afterward, surrounded by students who were just beginning their adult lives while I felt like mine was ending, I experienced something I had never felt before, complete and utter betrayal by the people I loved most in the world. That night, I sat in my studio apartment, the same cramped space I'd been living in for 5 years because I'd been putting every spare dollar into the family business, and tried to figure out what my options were. I could keep working for my brother, accepting that I would always be an employee in the company I had built. I could quit and try to start over at 28 with no savings, no business ownership, and no clear career path. Or I could fight. But fighting meant going up against my entire family, possibly destroying relationships forever, and spending money I didn't have on lawyers who might not be able to fix what I had already signed away. For 3 weeks, I went through the motions of my regular routine while feeling like I was living in someone else's life. I'd wake up at 5 a.m., open the original restaurant, manage the staff, handle customer complaints, coordinate with suppliers, review inventory, train new employees, and collapse into bed at midnight, only to start the cycle again the next day. But everything felt different now. The customers who used to brighten my day with their compliments about the food now just reminded me that I was serving meals in a restaurant I no longer owned. The staff who looked to me for guidance and support were technically my coworkers, not my employees. The suppliers who had worked with me for years to build relationships and negotiate better prices were doing business with Marcus, not me. The worst part was the family dinners, which continued every Sunday as if nothing had changed. My parents would ask about the restaurant's performance, and Marcus would share updates about expansion plans and profit margins while I sat quietly, picking at my mother's dumplings and wondering if they knew what he had done to me. I started to suspect they did know when I overheard a conversation between my mother and her sister during one of these dinners. I had gone to the kitchen to help clear dishes when I heard my aunt ask in Mandarin, "Are you sure this is the right thing to do to Sarah? She worked so hard for this family." My mother's response made my hands freeze on the stack of plates I was carrying. "Sarah is strong, and she'll always have a place in the family business. But Marcus is the son, and he has the education and the vision to take us to the next level. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions for the good of the whole family." Standing in that kitchen where I had learned to cook, where I had spent countless hours helping my parents build their American dream, I realized that my own family saw me as expendable. I was the dependable daughter who could be counted on to sacrifice her own future for everyone else's benefit, but I was never going to be seen as worthy of the success I had created. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. The next morning, instead of going to work, I drove to the downtown Chicago offices of Morrison, Keller and Associates, one of the city's most respected business litigation firms. I had researched them online and learned that Sarah Morrison had built her reputation representing people who had been cheated out of business partnerships by family members and former friends. The initial consultation fee was $500, money I definitely couldn't afford to spend casually, but as I sat in the elegant conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Sarah Morrison was about 50, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from winning battles most people are afraid to fight. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing more serious as I explained the timeline of events. "Sarah," she said when I finished, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What your family has done to you is not just morally wrong, it's legally actionable fraud. The fact that they had you sign documents without proper legal representation, while withholding material information about what you were actually agreeing to, gives us several potential avenues for recovery." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. So, I might actually be able to get my business back? It's not going to be easy or quick, and there are no guarantees in litigation. But based on what you've told me, you have a strong case for both fraudulent inducement and unjust enrichment. The fact that you can document your financial contributions, your operational involvement, and your role in the business's success gives us a solid foundation to work from. The retainer was $15,000, more money than I had in my savings account. But Sarah Morrison offered to work on a partial contingency basis, meaning she would take a percentage of any money we recovered instead of requiring all fees up front. "I need to be completely honest with you about what this process will look like," she continued. "Business litigation between family members gets ugly very quickly. They're going to try to paint you as a disgruntled employee who's trying to take advantage of your family's generosity. They'll argue that you knew exactly what you were signing and that you're only complaining now because you're jealous of your brother's success. What do we need to prove our case? We need to establish 3 things. First, that you were deceived about the true nature of the documents you signed. Second, that your contributions to the business were substantial enough to merit ownership rather than just employment, and third, that your family intentionally structured things to exclude you while benefiting from your work and investment. That afternoon, I withdrew my entire savings account and wrote Sarah Morrison a check for $8,000 with a promise to pay the remaining $7,000 within 30 days. Then I drove home and began the most difficult period of my adult life. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later, and the next day Marcus called me screaming. "How could you do this to our family, Sarah? How could you try to destroy everything we've built together?" "Everything we've built together?" I repeated. "Marcus, you literally stole my business from me." "I didn't steal anything. You signed those documents willingly. Nobody forced you to do anything. Because you lied to me about what they meant. Because I trusted you to protect my interests the same way I had always protected yours." The conversation devolved into shouting and ended with Marcus telling me I was no longer welcome at family dinners or in any of the restaurants. Jenny sent me a text message that evening that simply said, "I hope you're happy destroying our family for money." But the most painful reaction came from my parents. 3 days after the lawsuit became public, my mother showed up at my apartment at 7 in the morning, her eyes red from crying. "Sarah," she said in the mix of English and Mandarin we'd always used for serious conversations, "why are you doing this? Why are you hurting your brother?" "Mom, Marcus cheated me out of the business I built. I invested everything I had, and he manipulated me into signing it all away. But he's your brother. Family is supposed to come first. We're supposed to stick together, not fight in court like strangers." "I wanted to stick together, Mom. I spent 5 years sacrificing everything for this family. But they didn't want me as family. They wanted me as free labor." My mother was quiet for a long time, staring out my small apartment window at the busy street below. Finally, she said, "Your father and I came to this country with nothing. We worked so hard to build something we could pass on to our children. Now that dream is falling apart because you can't accept your place in the family. My place in the family was to give up my future so Marcus could have his. Your place in the family was to support each other, to build something together, not to fight over money like this." After she left, I sat on my couch and cried harder than I had since my father's heart attack. Because I realized that even my parents saw me as the problem, not the victim. In their minds, I was being selfish and greedy for wanting ownership of something I had created, instead of being grateful for the opportunity to work for my brother. The legal discovery process took 8 months and revealed details about the business that shocked even my lawyer. Marcus had been paying himself a salary of $200,000 annually, plus bonuses and expense accounts, while paying me $35,000. Jenny was receiving $1,500 monthly as a marketing consultant for work that consisted primarily of posting on Instagram and Facebook. More damaging was the evidence we uncovered about the expansion financing. Marcus had used my cosign loans to secure additional investor funding, telling potential backers that the business had 3 equal partners who were all committed to the long-term growth strategy. Several investors had specifically mentioned in their due diligence notes that they were impressed by the family partnership structure and the fact that all 3 siblings were invested in the success. But the most shocking discovery came when we subpoenaed Marcus's email records and found a chain of messages between him and Jenny from over 2 years earlier, discussing their plan to gradually push me out of ownership while keeping me involved operationally. In one email, Marcus had written, "Sarah is never going to be satisfied with just managing the restaurants long-term. She's going to want more control and recognition. But she doesn't have the business sophistication to handle expansion or investor relations. We need to structure things so she's locked into operations, but can't interfere with strategic decisions." Jenny's response was even more hurtful. "Agreed. Sarah is great at the day-to-day stuff, and she works harder than anyone, but she thinks too small. Plus, if we're going to attract serious investors, they want to see people with actual business credentials in leadership roles, not just someone who's good at frying rice." Reading those emails felt like discovering that people you trusted with your life had been planning your murder for years. The casual way they discussed manipulating me, the dismissive comments about my contributions, the calculated nature of their deception, it was almost impossible to process emotionally. But it also gave us the evidence we needed to prove fraud. The mediation session took place on a gray December morning in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and disappointment. Marcus arrived with 2 lawyers and an accountant. Jenny came as a witness. My parents sat in the hallway, refusing to choose sides but clearly hoping we could work things out as a family. For 6 hours, we sat across from each other while lawyers presented evidence and arguments. Marcus's team tried to argue that I had always been an employee, that my financial contributions were loans rather than investments, and that I was trying to take advantage of my family's success. But the emails were devastating to their case. When Sarah Morrison read Marcus's message about locking Sarah into operations out loud, I watched my brother's face turn red with embarrassment and anger. These communications clearly show premeditation and intent to defraud, my lawyer said calmly. Mr. Chen and Ms. Chun deliberately concealed their true intentions while soliciting substantial financial and operational contributions from my client. The mediator, a gray-haired woman named Patricia Santos who had been resolving business disputes for over 20 years, looked directly at Marcus and asked, "Can you explain to me why your sister, who by all accounts built the operational foundation for this business and invested substantial personal resources, should not have any ownership stake?" Marcus's primary lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, started talking about employment agreements and the difference between investment and compensation, but Ms. Santos cut him off. "I've been doing this for 2 decades, she said, and I can usually tell the difference between a legitimate business dispute and a family trying to screw over one of their own. This looks like the latter." After a brief recess, Marcus's team came back with a settlement offer. They would give me a 10% ownership stake in the business and increase my annual salary to $60,000. "That's insulting," Sarah Morrison said immediately. "My client invested over $200,000 and 5 years of her life building this business. 10% doesn't even cover her financial contributions, much less her sweat equity." We countered with 50% ownership and back pay for the difference between my salary and what I should have been earning as a partner. They came back with 15% and no back pay. We countered with 40% and reduced back pay. They came back with 20% and a promise to consider me for a management bonus program. After 8 hours of negotiation, we were deadlocked. Marcus refused to give me more than 25% ownership, and I refused to accept anything less than 40%. The mediation ended with both sides preparing for trial. That's when something unexpected happened. 2 weeks later, I got a call from David Kim, someone I had never heard of before. He identified himself as a restaurant industry investor who had been following the coverage of our lawsuit in the Chicago Business Journal. "I'm calling because I think you might be interested in a business opportunity," he said. "I've been looking for an experienced operator to partner with on a new Asian fusion concept, and your background is exactly what I'm looking for." David turned out to be a 45-year-old Korean-American entrepreneur who had built and sold 3 successful restaurant chains over the past 15 years. He was soft-spoken and thoughtful, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from real accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, and I found myself telling him not just about the lawsuit, but about my entire journey with the family restaurants. "Sarah," he said after I finished my story, "I want you to consider something. You're spending all this time and energy fighting to get back a piece of a business that your family has already poisoned for you. Even if you win, do you really want to work with people who treated you this way?" "But it's my business," I said. "I built it from nothing." "You built those specific restaurants from nothing. But the skills and knowledge and work ethic that made that possible, those belong to you, not to them. You could build something new, something better, something that's entirely yours." David's proposal was unlike anything I had ever considered. He wanted to provide the initial capital for a new restaurant concept that I would design and operate, with a 50-50 ownership split from day one. No hidden contracts, no family drama, no uncertainty about my role or my future. The Asian food market in Chicago is growing rapidly, but most of the concepts are either traditional family restaurants or completely Americanized chain food. There's a huge opportunity for someone who understands authentic preparation but can also innovate and modernize the experience. That night, I lay awake thinking about two very different paths forward. I could continue fighting Marcus and Jenny in court, spending months or years trying to recover a piece of a business where I would always be seen as the troublemaker who sued her own family. Or I could walk away and build something entirely new, something that would be mine from the beginning. The decision became clear when I got a text message from my mother the next morning. "Sarah, please stop this lawsuit. You're tearing our family apart. Can't you just be happy working for Marcus? Why do you need to own everything?" Even my own mother, who had watched me sacrifice my 20s to save the family business, couldn't understand why I deserved to own what. I was being greedy and selfish for wanting recognition and equity instead of just being grateful for a job. 6 months later, David Kim and I opened Harmony Kitchen in Logan Square, a neighborhood that was rapidly becoming Chicago's hottest dining destination. The concept was Asian fusion with a focus on fresh, locally sourced ingredients and creative presentations that honored traditional flavors while appealing to contemporary tastes. Everything about the experience was different from my family restaurants. The space was modern and bright, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that created a sophisticated but welcoming atmosphere. The menu featured dishes I had developed myself: Korean-style tacos with house-made kimchi, Vietnamese pho,